They were laughing when I thought everything was still safe. That sound, bright and careless, is what haunts me most now. I had opened my home believing love could still survive under one roof. The table was full, the lights were warm, and I told myself this night would finally be calm. I was wrong long before anyone knew. I ignored the quiet warning already beating inside my chest then. I moved through the room like a practiced host, smiling when expected, nodding when spoken to. Plates clinked softly, chairs scraped the floor, and voices overlapped without ever touching truth. My son sat across from me, relaxed, unaware, while his spouse laughed too loudly beside him. I noticed everything, yet somehow noticed nothing that truly mattered. That blindness would cost me more than dignity before nightfall and steal my breath. The wine bottle rested in the center like a neutral witness, dark glass catching the light. It had waited patiently, untouched, while conversations circled around it. This was not just wine to me. It carried years, anniversaries, grief, and promises I kept after my husband died. Still, I treated it casually, never imagining danger could wear something so familiar. I trusted the room, people, and the love I believed remained. When I reached for the glass, my hand hesitated without permission. A pressure bloomed in my chest, sudden and unreasonable, like grief remembering its way home. I paused, smiling to hide the feeling, telling myself I was tired, emotional, overthinking as usual. Women like me are trained to doubt instinct before danger, and I obeyed that lesson. I lifted the glass anyway, pretending nothing inside me was screaming that night. The room seemed to slow as the glass rose, red liquid trembling near the rim. Faces blurred at the edges, laughter stretching thin and strange. Somewhere a fork dropped, sharp against porcelain, making me flinch. I told myself it meant nothing, yet my pulse argued otherwise. This was the moment my life balanced quietly, seconds before truth intervened. I did not know who was about to shatter it forever then. My son moved before sound reached me. His chair scraped back hard, legs biting the floor. His body suddenly rigid. I saw his face drain, eyes wide, fixed somewhere behind my shoulder. Fear crossed him like lightning. He opened his mouth, closed it, then stepped toward me with urgency I had never seen directed at me. In that instant, my heart understood danger before my mind allowed it to breathe. "Don't," he said, his voice cracking the room open. The word landed heavy, impossible to ignore. Conversations died mid-sentence, eyes snapping toward us. My fingers tightened around the stem as confusion washed through me. I searched his face for explanation, but found only terror and disbelief tangled together, as if he had witnessed something unspeakable moments earlier. The air thickened, pressing against my lungs, refusing comfort or clarity anymore now. I froze with the glass suspended between intention and consequence. My smile collapsed, replaced by a question I couldn't voice. The room held its breath with me, waiting. In that silence, I felt every year of motherhood, every sacrifice, every compromise tremble. Whatever my son had seen was powerful enough to stop time and rewrite who we were. I sensed the fracture forming, invisible but already irreversible inside us all. He reached out, palm up, pleading without touching me. His eyes flicked again toward the table, toward the bottle, toward something I still couldn't name. I followed his gaze slowly, dread crawling up my spine. Laughter felt obscene now, echoing from a life already slipping away. I had never seen my child look at me like that. It was fear mixed with urgency, and a warning I did not understand. The glass hovered inches from my lips, heavy as fate. I stood there suspended while my son took another step closer. I did not know then that this pause would save me, or that it would destroy everything I believed about family. All I knew was that something was terribly wrong, and I was finally being stopped. The night leaned forward, ready to reveal what should never be unseen next. I didn't trust the marriage the day it began, and I hated myself for pretending that feeling was wrong. That doubt lived quietly inside me for years, folded neatly behind smiles and polite silence. I told myself love meant acceptance, that a mother should step back and let her son choose his life. What I never admitted was how often my instincts whispered warnings I chose not to hear. When my son first brought their spouse home, the charm arrived before sincerity. Compliments were delivered with perfect timing, laughter a little too rehearsed. I noticed how questions about me were always followed by glances around my house, as if measuring walls instead of listening to answers. Everyone else called it confidence. I called it something else in my heart, but I buried the word deep. At family dinners, the disrespect was subtle enough to be denied. Jokes landed softly, but always at my expense. "Oh, she still does things the old way," they once said, smiling sweetly. Everyone laughed, including me, because not laughing would have made me difficult. That was the first compromise, and it set a pattern I regret more than I can say. Decisions started happening without me. Changes in my own home were discussed like group plans, not personal boundaries. Furniture moved, rooms reassigned. Even traditions shifted, quietly edited out as if outdated. I'd find out after the fact, always reassured with the same line. "We thought you wouldn't mind." I did mind. I just didn't feel allowed to say so. I swallowed my instincts for the sake of peace, believing silence was maturity. I told myself I was being supportive, that families evolve and parents must loosen their grip. But there's a difference between letting go and being erased. Each small dismissal chipped away at my sense of place. I became careful with my words, careful with my reactions, careful not to disturb a balance that only existed because I kept shrinking. The looks were worse than the words. Eyes that scanned me when I spoke, as if calculating value. Smiles that tightened whenever my son and I shared a private joke. I felt tolerated, not respected. When I'd catch it, I'd question myself. Maybe I was sensitive. Maybe grief made me paranoid. Maybe I was imagining hostility where none existed. Doubt became my constant companion. Then came the conversations about money, disguised as concern. "Have you thought about the future?" they'd ask, voice gentle. "Things are expensive these days." I noticed how quickly the topic drifted from my health to my house, from my comfort to my assets, from my plans to their security. It always felt premature, like discussing inheritance while the owner was still breathing in the room. My house stopped feeling like mine long before that night. Papers appeared on tables I hadn't placed there. Drawers felt rearranged. Once, a document vanished entirely, brushed off later as a misunderstanding. "You must have misplaced it," they said. I nodded, even though I knew exactly where I kept it. That was the day I first felt like a guest in my own life. My son tried to bridge the gap, always gentle, always hopeful. "Don't read too much into it," he'd say. "They mean well." I wanted to believe him because believing him meant believing my family was still safe. I didn't want to be the mother who caused division by speaking uncomfortable truths. So I stayed quiet when comments stung. I stayed polite when boundaries blurred. I stayed still when my role shifted from matriarch to inconvenience. I told myself love required endurance. I told myself patience would be rewarded. What I didn't see was how silence teaches others how far they can go. By the time whispers of inheritance became casual conversation, something inside me had already withdrawn. I began locking parts of myself away, protecting memories instead of sharing them. I stopped correcting people. I stopped asserting space. I adapted to being overlooked. That adaptation felt like survival at the time. Standing there with the wine glass frozen in my hand earlier that night, all of this rushed back to me. The years of swallowed words. The times I felt watched, measured, dismissed. That pause wasn't new fear. It was recognition. Because the truth I hadn't yet said aloud was already clear to me then. The wine was not the first thing of mine that had been touched without permission. The cellar was never just a room. It was where my marriage still breathed. Even now, with the glass frozen inches from my lips, my mind escaped downward, past the laughter, past the table, back into the quiet underground where memory was stored in glass and dust. The wine cellar lived beneath the house like a heartbeat. Cool, dim, steady. My late husband built it with his own hands, measuring twice, sanding carefully, insisting that patience made everything better. Every bottle had a story, and he remembered each one. Anniversaries, promotions, a year we almost lost each other but didn't. Grief sealed into corks and promises sealed into labels. When he died, I kept the cellar untouched for a long time. Felt like disturbing a grave. Eventually, I learned to go down there alone, tracing labels with my fingers, letting silence speak where he once had. That wine was legacy. Not wealth. Not luxury. Memory. Proof that something good had existed and mattered. I told my son that once, standing beside him between the racks. Some things aren't meant to be rushed, I said. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. His spouse laughed lightly behind us. Well, old things eventually need to be used up, they said, smiling. The words landed wrong. Too casual. Too dismissive. It's just wine, they added quickly, as if correcting me. I smiled because that's what I had trained myself to do. But inside something recoiled. You don't call a life shared an old thing, unless you never respected it to begin with. After that, comments slipped in whenever the cellar came up. Why save it if you're not drinking it? You can't take it with you. They said it like practicality, like kindness even. But it felt like erosion. Each remark rubbed away meaning until memory was treated like clutter waiting to be cleared. Weeks before that night, I noticed a space on the rack. A bottle missing from the third row, left side near the back. I knew because I counted them sometimes, not obsessively, just lovingly. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the empty cradle. My first thought was grief making me forgetful. My second thought scared me more. When I asked casually at dinner, my voice light, no accusation, the answer came too quickly. You probably opened it already, they said. My son shrugged. Maybe for a guest. I nodded again, swallowing doubt like medicine I didn't trust. But I hadn't opened it. I remembered that bottle clearly. It was meant for a future I still believed in then. I told myself I'd misplaced time, not truth. That was easier. That was safer. I didn't want to believe someone would reach into a place so personal without asking. Standing upstairs now, the glass trembling in my hand, the cellar memory sharpened. I could almost smell the cool stone. Hear my husband's voice explaining why this bottle mattered. The wine in my glass came from that room. From that history. From something sacred I had protected. Around me the dining room lights felt too bright. Shadows clung to corners. The wine bottle on the table looked ordinary to everyone else. To me it was suddenly exposed. Vulnerable. Like a diary left open. My son's voice still echoed in my ears. Don't. The urgency of it. The fear. I looked again at the bottle, really looked. At how it sat slightly off-center. As if recently handled. At the faint smear near the neck I hadn't noticed before. Memories rearranged themselves brutally. Jokes. The missing bottle. The conversations about using things up. The way my cellar had become common property without permission. I felt foolish for defending politeness over instinct. For confusing peace with safety. I understood then that memory can be repurposed by the wrong hands. That legacy can be seen not as sacred, but as opportunity. The realization burned colder than anger. It felt like betrayal layered over grief, the deepest kind. The glass remained raised. My arm ached. Time refused to move forward. And in that stillness, I knew something precious had already been violated. I was just beginning to understand how. I had never seen my son look at someone the way he was looking now. It wasn't anger alone. It was shock colliding with betrayal, disbelief cracking something deep inside him, all flashing across his face in a single breath. The room was still frozen around us, my glass still hovering uselessly in my hand. My arm trembled, but I couldn't lower it yet. I was watching my child instead. His eyes weren't on me anymore. They were locked on something behind my shoulder, something that had turned his blood cold. First I thought he was looking at the bottle. Then I realized he was looking past it. at the person standing closest to it. His jaw tightened. His lips parted as if he wanted to scream, but only air came out. I saw his hands curl into fists, nails digging into his palms the way they used to when he was a boy trying not to cry. That small, familiar gesture broke my heart before any words were spoken. "Mom," he said, barely louder than a whisper. The room leaned toward him. Chairs creaked. Someone cleared their throat too loudly, as if sound itself felt inappropriate. My son took another step forward, his eyes never leaving that spot behind me. I turned slightly, confused, but he shook his head sharply. "Don't drink that," he said again, this time firmer. My chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice unsteady despite my effort. He swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing. I could see the moment he decided whether to protect peace or speak truth. His breath shuddered when he chose truth. "I just saw." He stopped, shaking his head as if trying to wake himself from a nightmare. "I just saw you do something." Silence swallowed the room whole. No one laughed. No one interrupted. Even the lights seemed harsher now, exposing rather than warming. I felt suddenly naked, exposed in a way that had nothing to do with my body. "Saw who?" I asked, even though something inside me already knew. He finally looked at me then, and that hurt worse. His eyes were wet, not with tears yet, but with something dangerously close. Guilt, confusion, rage, love fighting loyalty. "You," he said quietly, and then corrected himself. "You," he repeated, pointing behind me. A sharp inhale rippled through the room. I heard someone whisper my name like a prayer or a warning. My fingers tightened around the stem of the glass until they ached. "What did you see?" asked, my voice thinner now. He hesitated, eyes flicking around as if suddenly aware of witnesses. Family, friends. Faces that had been smiling minutes earlier now wore expressions of curiosity and discomfort. This was not a private moment anymore. This was exposure. "I saw you at the table," he said, words measured, careful. "When Mom wasn't looking." The person behind me laughed nervously. "You must be mistaken," they said. "I was just helping." That laugh made my son flinch. "Helping with what?" he snapped. The room felt smaller, air thicker, like the walls were leaning in to hear. I slowly lowered the glass, setting it down on the table with exaggerated care. The sound of it touching would echoed louder than it should have. "I saw you open the bottle," he continued, his voice rising despite his effort to control it. "I saw you pour something into it." Gasps broke out like fractures in glass. Someone stood abruptly. Another voice murmured, "That's impossible." I couldn't tell if it was denial or hope. "That's a lie," came the response, too quick, too sharp. "Why would I?" "Stop," my son said, cutting them off. His voice cracked on the word. "Just stop." I watched him unravel in real time. This was the moment a marriage bends or breaks, when truth demands payment. His hands were shaking now, his face pale under the lights. He looked like a stranger and my little boy all at once. "Tell me," he said, his voice trembling despite himself. "Why were you touching my mother's wine?" That was the question. Simple, devastating, unavoidable. No one answered immediately. The silence stretched, heavy and accusing. Every eye shifted between my son, the person behind me, and finally the bottle sitting quietly between us all. It had become the center of gravity, pulling everything toward it. I felt my stomach drop, dread pooling low and deep. The cellar memories, the missing bottle, the jokes about old things being used up, they all screamed for attention now. My hands felt numb. They started then stopped. My son took one final step forward, positioning himself between me and the table. Protective. Resolute. Something in him had already changed. "Everyone stop talking," he said. Every sound died instantly. And together, without being told, every single person in the room turned to look at the wine bottle. I learned that truth doesn't explode. It bleeds out slowly, humiliating everyone it touches. The room stayed frozen around the bottle, as if we were all afraid it might speak next. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure others could hear it, a frantic reminder that I was still alive and standing inside my own house. My son broke the silence first. His voice was steadier now, but that steadiness felt forced, like a wall built too quickly. "I went into the kitchen for water," he said. "I forgot my phone on the counter." He paused, swallowing hard. I watched his throat move, felt my own tighten in sympathy. Whatever he was about to say had already wounded him. "I saw you," he continued, pointing again, hand shaking. "You were standing by the bottle. You looked around first. Then you opened something small and poured it in." A murmur swept the room, sharp and startled. Someone whispered my name. Another voice said, "This is insane." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe properly. I was listening, and at the same time I was remembering every moment that led us here. "That's not true," the spouse snapped immediately. "Too quickly. Too cleanly. You're imagining things." "I'm not," my son said, louder now. "I was right there." "You've had a drink already," they shot back. "You were distracted. You misread it." I flinched at that. The calmness of the denial unsettled me more than shouting would have. It sounded practiced, like a speech prepared for the exact moment it might be needed. "I was helping," they added, softer now. "Your mother asked me to." I hadn't. The lie hovered in the air between us, bold and unapologetic. I wanted to speak to correct it, but my voice felt trapped behind my ribs. Disbelief battled with a cold, creeping validation. I had felt this coming. I just hadn't wanted to be right. "Why would I do something like that?" they asked, spreading their hands, appealing to the room. "This is ridiculous." Someone nodded. Someone else shifted uncomfortably. I recognized the familiar urge in the room, to smooth things over, to label discomfort a misunderstanding. It was the same urge that had silenced me for years. "Maybe it was nothing," an aunt said carefully. "We're all a bit tense." "Yes," another voice agreed. "Let's not jump to conclusions." My son turned to them sharply. "I know what I saw." His words cracked, and that crack ran straight through me. I had spent years protecting peace at my own expense, and now my child was being asked to do the same. I felt something harden inside my chest. "I believe him," I said quietly. Every head turned toward me. It was the first time I'd spoken since the confrontation began. My voice surprised even me. It didn't shake. "I believe my son," I repeated. The spouse stared at me, eyes narrowing just enough to be noticed. For a moment something slipped, annoyance, calculation, resentment. Then the mask returned. "This is getting out of hand," they said. "If you're feeling unwell, maybe we should call someone." The suggestion landed wrong. Too convenient. Too sudden. "I think we should," someone else said nervously. "Just to be safe." "Safe from what?" my son demanded. No one answered. The implication hung there, ugly and unspoken. I felt my stomach twist. The thought that I might already have been in danger made my skin prickle with delayed fear. "Open the bottle," my son said suddenly. Silence again. "No," the spouse said flatly. That single word echoed louder than any confession. My son stared at them, disbelief turning slowly into something darker. "If you didn't do anything," he said, "then you won't mind." Hands hovered uncertainly. No one moved. I realized then how alone truth can be in a room full of people. I stepped forward, intending to reach for the bottle myself. That's when it happened. Someone bumped the table. Accidentally, they would say later. The glass tipped, then fell, hitting the edge with a dull sound before shattering against the floor. Red liquid spread across the white tablecloth, seeping fast, unstoppable. Gasps erupted. Chairs scraped back. I stared down at the stain, my breath leaving me in a sharp rush. The wine looked disturbingly like blood, blooming outward in an uneven pool. For a moment no one spoke. We all watched it spread, watched innocence disappear beneath color. I felt dizzy, my knees weak, the room tilting just slightly. My son stepped in front of me again, blocking my view. His hands clenched at his sides. "That could have been her," he said hoarsely. The weight of that sentence crushed the air from my lungs. I reached for the edge of the table to steady myself, my fingers brushing fabric soaked in red. And as people rushed forward, voices rising in panic and accusation, one thought echoed louder than all the rest. If that glass hadn't fallen, I might have. The room didn't erupt, it collapsed inward like a lung losing air. Everything rushed at once, sound and color blurring together, my heartbeat hammering so violently I thought it might tear free from my chest. People moved, but I couldn't track who. Chairs scraped, someone swore under their breath. Another voice rose too high, too fast. The smell hit next, sharp, unfamiliar, wrong. Someone leaned over the tablecloth soaked in red and recoiled. "That doesn't smell like wine," they said. My knees buckled slightly. I gripped the table edge, knuckles whitening, fighting dizziness. The room tilted, lights stretching into halos. Somewhere close, a woman began to cry, soft at first, then louder, as if grief finally found permission. I felt detached from my body, like I was watching myself from a distance, an old woman standing in the wreckage of her own family. "Mom," my son said urgently. His hands were on my shoulders now, steady, grounding. I looked up at him and barely recognized the man staring back. Something fundamental had shifted in him. The boy who avoided conflict was gone. In his place stood someone fierce, decisive, unafraid. "Sit down," he told me. It wasn't a suggestion. I obeyed without thinking, my legs giving in as he guided me into a chair. He positioned himself in front of me, back straight, eyes scanning the room like a guard. "No one touches that bottle," he said. The command cut through the noise. Conversations faltered. Even the crying quieted. I saw how people reacted, how instinctively they listened. Power had changed hands in seconds, and it wasn't subtle. The spouse tried to speak, voice sharp but cracking at the edges. "This is getting ridiculous. You're overreacting." My son turned on them so fast it made me flinch. "You don't get to tell me that anymore." I watched their composure fracture. Hands that had always been confident now trembled slightly. Their gaze darted around the room, searching for allies, finding fewer than expected. "Call it off," they said, lowering their voice. "We can talk privately." "No," my son replied. "We're done doing that." Someone reached for the bottle again, curiosity overpowering caution. "Don't," my son snapped. "I said don't touch it." Another guest bent close to the spill, sniffed, then pulled back sharply. "There's something chemical," they said. "That's not right." My stomach lurched. I pressed a hand to my mouth, swallowing nausea that burned my throat. The realization came late but heavy. If that glass hadn't fallen, it would have been inside me. I would have trusted it. I always did. "We need to call emergency services," someone said. "Yes," another voice agreed quickly. "Just in case." The spouse shook their head, panic flashing openly now. "This is insane. You're blowing this up." My son didn't look at them. He pulled out his phone, fingers steady despite the chaos around us. "I'm calling," he said. The sound of the call connecting felt louder than the shattering glass had been. I listened as he spoke, clear and controlled, describing what had happened. Hearing it out loud made my chest tighten. "Prison. Suspicion. Name." As he spoke, the room seemed to split into sides. Some hovered near me, concern etched into their faces. Others stood back, uncertain, afraid of choosing wrong. The spouse retreated slightly, bumping into a chair, their mask fully gone now. "This isn't what it looks like," they whispered, more to themselves than anyone else. I watched them, this person I had tried so hard to accommodate, to understand, to include. I felt something unexpected then. Not rage, not triumph, but grief. Grief for the years I had diminished myself to keep things smooth. Grief for my son, who would never see his marriage the same way again. My heart raced uncontrollably. Each beat felt like a reminder of how close I'd come. I focused on breathing, on staying conscious, on the feel of my son's presence near me. "It's going to be okay," he said quietly, leaning down so only I could hear. "I've got you." Those words broke something open in me. I nodded, tears blurring my vision. I had spent so long protecting him that I forgot he might one day need to protect me. The sound of sirens cut through the night air, faint at first, then growing louder. Red and blue light flashed against the windows, painting the walls in harsh colors. The room fell silent again, a different kind of silence now, heavy with consequence. Someone moved to open the front door. Cold air rushed in, carrying the unmistakable presence of authority. The night that had begun as a family gathering had turned into a scene of investigation. As uniformed figures stepped inside, I realized how fragile survival truly is. How easily a life can hinge on a pause, a spill, a son's courage. And as the flashing lights filled my home, one terrifying question settled deep inside me. Was I ever meant to survive this night at all? The cold room made everything feel smaller, including the lies. Gone were the warm lights and crowded voices. In their place was silence, metal chairs, and air that smelled faintly of disinfectant and consequence. I sat wrapped in a thin blanket someone had handed me, my hands folded together to stop their shaking. My son sat beside me, close but not touching, as if afraid he might break if he moved too suddenly. Across from us, the truth waited. Not eager, not remorseful, just trapped. This was where secrets came undone. Not with shouting, not with rage, but with fear pressing down until words slipped out simply to breathe. "No one was supposed to drink it," the spouse said finally, voice low, eyes fixed on the floor. The sentence hit me harder than any accusation. I felt my chest tighten, a sharp ache spreading slowly, deliberately. Not supposed to drink it. As if intent mattered more than outcome. My son didn't speak. He just stared, jaw clenched, eyes dark and hollow. I had never seen devastation sit so quietly inside someone. "What did you put in it?" one of the officers asked. There was a pause. Long one. In that space, I heard everything we had never said as a family. Every compromise. Every silence. Every moment I chose peace over truth. "It was just enough to make her sick," came the answer. "Scare her." "Scare me." I closed my eyes, breathing through the nausea rising in my throat. Fear, I realized, had always been their language. Fear of losing control. Fear of losing access. Fear of a future that didn't belong to them. The words began spilling faster after that, tumbling out not from guilt but desperation. Plans mentioned too casually. Documents altered quietly. Conversations held behind closed doors, always when I was resting or not feeling well. We needed things settled, they said. She kept changing her mind. My son's head snapped up. Changing her mind about what? Silence again. He deserved the truth, even if it destroyed him. The house, they admitted. The accounts. She wanted to revise the will. My stomach dropped. I remembered papers moved, files missing, suggestions made under the disguise of concern. I had trusted enough to doubt myself instead. She was taking too long, they continued. Everything was tied up. We couldn't plan. Like my life was an obstacle. I felt suddenly very old. Not weak but aware. A lifetime of work, love, and survival reduced to an inconvenience in someone else's timeline. My son stood abruptly, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "You were going to poison my mother over money?" "It wasn't poison," they insisted quickly. "It wasn't meant to kill her." The officer's pen paused mid-air. I laughed then. A quiet, broken sound that surprised even me. "That's supposed to make it better." Yes. They looked at me for the first time, really looked, eyes wide as if seeing me not as a resource but as a person. Too late. "It just needed to look like an accident," they whispered. That sentence carved something permanent into my chest. Accident. As if my survival had always been optional. My son stopped pacing. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He simply asked one question, voice barely holding together. How long have you been planning this? Another pause. Longer. He deserved honesty, even if it shattered what remained. Months, came the answer. Month. I thought of family dinners, holidays, shared laughter. All of it poisoned long before the wine ever was. I felt grief not just for myself, but for my son, who had loved someone capable of this. He sat back down slowly, hands folded now the same way mine were. I saw it then. His devastation was heavier than anger. Anger could burn out. This would stay. This wasn't just about my mother, he said quietly. You were going to destroy our family. There was no response. No defense left. Only the sound of breathing in a room stripped bare of excuses. I'm sorry, they said finally. The words floated uselessly between us. Too small. Too late. Some apologies don't heal. They only confirm how deep the wound truly is. I realized then that the wine was never the real betrayal. It was only the tool. The beginning. The true poison had been poured long before that night. Into trust, into marriage, into the idea of family itself. And as I sat there, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, listening to my son's quiet heartbreak, I understood with terrifying clarity. What happened to me was only the first chapter of what they were willing to do. I always believed love would protect us, but money taught me how easily it can betray. I never realized the word inheritance could feel heavier than grief, colder than a funeral, sharper than any knife. In the weeks after that night, our home no longer belonged to laughter or memory. It belonged to contracts, papers, signatures, and consequences. The lawyer's office smelled of polished wood and authority. Every surface gleamed, every voice measured. I sat with my hands folded, watching pens scratch across legal forms, as if ink itself could weigh guilt and loyalty. Words I had spoken freely for decades now carried weight only in black and white. Every clause was a verdict. You understand these conditions? The lawyer asked, voice clipped. I nodded, though I felt like a child again. A child forced to listen to adults decide what's right while the wrong was already done. My son stood beside me, silent, eyes full of restrained emotion. His presence was grounding, but it also reminded me how much had already been taken from him. The spouse was there too, not by invitation but by right, or at least by expectation. They didn't speak much. Just observed, calculating, scanning every paper like it could be a loophole or a weapon. Their charm was gone, replaced by cold patience. I realized then that they had never seen my family as people. They had always seen us as lines in a ledger. You are relinquishing any claim to the primary residence, the lawyer said, eyes flicking toward them. Do you understand? Yes, came the terse reply, voice forced calm. My stomach tightened. I thought of the countless dinners, the holidays, the quiet moments they had infiltrated with manipulation. My son's hand brushed mine for a fleeting second. I wanted to say, it's not your fault, but the words felt useless here. Fault was irrelevant. Survival mattered more. Every phrase felt like accusation. Every signature a battle. The assets are to be distributed according to my will, I dictated, voice steady despite my shaking heart. And any attempts to interfere will be contested fully. The lawyer's pen stopped for a moment. Even they seemed to recognize the finality in my tone. I was no longer the polite, accommodating mother. I was someone who had survived betrayal and intended to defend what was hers, finally without compromise. You cannot benefit from my silence again, I added quietly, almost to myself. My words trembled with relief and fear. Relief that I was taking control. Fear for the repercussions yet to come. The spouse's eyes narrowed. There was a twitch in their jaw. Something unmasked that I had only glimpsed before. The realization that their influence had ended. They would not manipulate, threaten, or pretend here. Not anymore. My son exhaled beside me, tension loosening just slightly. I caught the faintest flicker of gratitude in his gaze. Not for the money but for the justice I was finally enacting. A promise that no one could rewrite. I thought of all the nights I had swallowed pride to avoid conflict, all the compromises made to maintain peace. How long I had doubted myself, questioned my instincts, let fear dictate kindness. All of it distilled into this single act of declaration. I had survived the betrayal, and now I would decide its consequences. "You're certain?" the lawyer asked, a final check before the papers became law. I nodded, firm this time. Certain and irrevocable. There was no going back. Every hesitation I had ever allowed had taught me this moment's value. I realized that money was never about wealth. It was about power, leverage, and survival. And I had been naive, even while I tried to teach my son about kindness, trust, and loyalty. I had raised him into this pain, but he was not to blame. I carried that responsibility silently, even as I acted decisively. The documents were signed. The papers stacked neatly, final. The spouse's glare followed the pen, but it could not penetrate the certainty I felt. I had acted not out of spite, but protection. Protection for memory, for legacy, for the family they tried to unravel. I left the office that day knowing some doors would never open again. Some trusts would never be rebuilt. Some relationships had been severed beyond repair. And for the first time in years I felt a strange, heavy relief. I had made my decision. Quiet, irreversible, and necessary. And in that moment, I knew exactly who would never benefit from my silence again. The house was quieter than I remembered, but not peaceful. Every step echoed too sharply, each footfall bouncing off walls that once held laughter, arguments, whispers, and comfort. Now it held only memory. And the memory was heavy. I walked slowly through the hallways, brushing my fingers against banisters I had polished countless times. Each touch felt like reaching for someone who wasn't there, or perhaps for someone who had changed entirely. I passed rooms I had loved, corners where my husband's laughter once lingered, and the dining room that had turned into a battlefield. The wine cellar door remained closed. I didn't want to go down there yet. Some wounds required distance before inspection. I remembered the glass spilled across white linen, the fear, my son's protective stance, the panic, the police. All of it lived in the wood grain, the faint scent of aged wine, the cold air. My son followed quietly, shoes soft against the floor. He didn't speak at first, and I didn't either. Silence felt safer than words. But eventually we reached the living room, the place where so many ordinary moments had taken place. Birthdays, movie nights, small arguments that now seemed trivial. "Mom," he said finally, voice low, I don't know how we even start fixing this." I looked at him and felt the weight of truth settle. There was nothing to fix. Not in the way we had imagined. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I don't think some things are meant to be fixed," I admitted. "Some things just need to be survived." He nodded slowly, eyes tracing the edges of furniture, as if familiar objects could anchor him to sanity. "I thought family meant protection," he said quietly, almost a question. "Sometimes protection comes in ways we don't recognize," I told him. "Sometimes it's saying no. Sometimes it's keeping some doors closed." We sat together on the couch, shoulders barely touching. I felt the strange mix of grief and relief curl through me. Grief for what had been broken, for the family that would never be the same. Relief that we had survived the night, that my son had acted with courage, that some boundaries had been restored. The silence stretched, but it no longer felt threatening. Felt honest, safe in its way. I realized that after betrayal, clarity arrives not in comfort, but in acknowledgement. I thought about the laughter that had filled these rooms, now replaced by quiet awareness. About conversations that would never repeat themselves. About trust, the fragile foundation of any home, now permanently fractured. And yet something remained, something we could hold on to. "Do you think it will ever be normal again?" he asked. I shook my head slowly. "Not the way it was. But maybe we can find a different normal." He didn't respond immediately. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, absorbing my words. The sunlight filtering through the curtains caught dust in slow arcs, making the room feel both fragile and alive. I walked to the window, watching the yard, the place where my husband once planted flowers, where children had chased balls, where quiet evenings were once predictable. Everything seemed smaller now, compressed by the weight of memory and loss. Turning back, I realized my son was still sitting there, staring at nothing, perhaps at everything. He was learning that love doesn't always protect you. Family doesn't always shield you. And trust can vanish in a single night. I sat beside him again, letting the silence hold us. Some doors, I understood finally, close not because we want to punish, but because they need to keep us alive. And in that quiet I felt it, grief, yes, but also survival. The house was full of echoes, but some of them were ours to keep. Some doors closed forever so others would not kill us. Justice didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived quietly, almost invisibly. No one shouted. No one stormed the courtroom. It didn't need fireworks or dramatic gestures. It came in the form of papers stamped, signatures recorded, and final decisions delivered with clinical efficiency. The truth, finally acknowledged, moved steadily, almost silently, but with absolute weight. I watched it all unfold from the edge, feeling both relief and a strange hollowness. My son stood beside me, tense but composed. We didn't need words. The process itself was enough to confirm what we already knew. Lies crumble slowly when confronted by evidence, and that night had given us plenty. The spouse was present, but their confidence had evaporated. Their posture, once upright, had slumped imperceptibly, betraying the awareness that influence could no longer protect them. They answered questions with clipped words, eyes flicking nervously toward my son and me. The room had shifted. Power had quietly moved, and everyone noticed. "They'll have to pay restitution," one of the officials murmured as I followed their motions with my eyes. Red ink underlined consequences I had only hoped would come. A fine, legal restrictions, monitoring. They all unfolded in orderly, irreversible steps. No theatrics, no applause, just the calm machinery of accountability. I thought about the other family members present. Some were shocked, faces pale and tense. Others whispered behind hands, mouths pressed tight, measuring how much they could trust me now. Reputation is fragile. Lies may fly, but truth, once recorded in official channels, travels faster, stronger, and more relentlessly than anyone expects. My son's hand brushed mine briefly, a small, quiet acknowledgement. No words were necessary. He understood. Understood. We had survived the manipulation, survived the danger, and finally, the world acknowledged it. Not with spectacle, but with weight. I remembered the spilled wine, the shattered glass, the fear that night had brought. I thought of the cellar, of memory weaponized against me, of the betrayal that had pierced the family from the inside. And yet, here it was. Quiet justice, steady and final. No dramatic proclamations, just consequences that couldn't be ignored, altered, or undone. The spouse's eyes flicked toward me briefly. There was a flash of resentment, of disbelief, perhaps even of fear. They realized what I had understood long ago. Control was never theirs to keep. The room itself seemed to acknowledge it, walls reflecting authority without raising a voice. I reflected on what this meant for me, not just for my son, not just for our family, but for me. For years, I had prioritized peace over self-preservation, silence over acknowledgement. I had swallowed pride, ignored instincts, and tolerated disrespect to maintain appearances. But survival and clarity had a cost, and I had finally paid it. Walking out of the procedural calm, I felt the weight lift, not like a celebration, but like exhalation after holding a breath too long. The house, the legacy, the family, nothing had been the same since that night. But in this quiet reckoning, I realized I had reclaimed something more intimate than money or property. Agency. The right to act, to decide, to speak, to protect. It was mine again, quietly, irreversibly. My son looked at me, and for the first time since everything had begun, I felt the deep alignment of trust, of family, of being seen. Not as a mother defined by obligation or fear, but as a person who had endured, survived, and chosen. As we left the building, the air sharp and cold, I inhaled fully, feeling the life I had fought to preserve. The past could not be undone, the betrayal could not be erased, but I could choose what mattered next. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. I finally choose myself over keeping peace. I descended the stairs to the cellar alone, and the silence hit me like a weight I had been carrying for months. The air smelled faintly of oak and age, the familiar scent of wine mingling with memory and grief. The bottles lined the walls like sentinels, each one a fragment of a life I had built, a past I had nearly lost. I ran my fingers along the wooden racks, pausing at the last unopened bottle. It wasn't special, not in the way the missing bottle had been, but it carried significance of a different kind. Finality, closure. The glass I lifted this time trembled slightly, but with intention, not fear. I remembered that night vividly. The spilled wine, my son's protective stance, the betrayal, the disbelief, the chaos. I remembered the fear, the cold realization that someone I trusted wanted to harm me. And yet, I also remembered the quiet courage that emerged, the steadfast truth that refused to bend. That memory gave me strength now, grounding me in a way that nothing else could. I uncorked the bottle slowly, the sound echoing faintly against stone walls. I could almost hear the echoes of arguments, whispers, and laughter that had filled this house, now ghosts of what had been and reminders of what survived. The liquid swirled in the glass, a deep, rich red reflecting candlelight and shadow. I took a moment to breathe it all in. I thought of my son, of his courage, and the way he had stood between me and harm. I thought of the spouse whose charm had masked danger, whose plans had crumbled quietly under truth. I thought of myself, and the resilience I had discovered in fear, in betrayal, in survival. "This isn't revenge," I whispered to the empty room. "It's recognition. And resolve." I raised the glass, not to toast anyone, not to celebrate the chaos, but to honor endurance. To acknowledge that survival is sometimes the quietest victory, and that strength can arrive unexpectedly, like light breaking through a storm. The wine caught the flicker of the cellar light, deep and honest, almost as if it were reflecting me back. I let it linger on my lips for a long moment, tasting more than just wine. I tasted survival, clarity, and the sharp tang of lessons learned too late for comfort, but not too late for wisdom. I sipped slowly, savoring the ritual of closure. It wasn't triumphal. It wasn't bitter. It was deliberate, a quiet acknowledgement that I had endured, that I had been believed when it mattered most, and that I had refused to let destruction define me. The room seemed to exhale with me, settling into shadows that no longer felt oppressive, but protective. I realized that some families break you, yes, but some reveal who you truly are. The betrayal had shown me pain, yes, but it had also revealed strength I didn't know I possessed. I set the glass down gently, savoring the weight of the moment. It felt like a boundary drawn in stone, a line between what had been and what would be. I had survived. I had been tested. I had chosen courage, truth, and survival over fear and silence. I stood alone in that cellar, yet I was not lonely. I was whole. I had been forged in the crucible of betrayal, and I emerged not bitter, but resolved. The house above may carry echoes of what happened, but here, in this quiet stone sanctuary, I reclaimed myself. Some families break you. Others reveal who you really are. And as I lifted that last glass one final time, I understood the truth of both.